And let's now take this forward with Omar Barghouti, prominent Palestinian human rights defender. He's also the co-founder of the BDS movement, or the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. Omar Barghouti, thank you so much for joining us at what continues to be a really troubled time. What is the sense? I mean, you've been a very prominent Palestinian human rights defender for a long time. Can you tell us about the situation now inside the Gaza Strip? Also the West Bank to some extent, but what's happening inside the Gaza Strip? What are you being able to pick up?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. The main point is that yesterday, United Nations experts have decried Israel's bombing of hospitals and schools as crimes against humanity and called for, quote, prevention of genocide. This is extremely important because this changes everything. We are dealing with an unfolding genocide. As the US-based Center for Constitutional Rights has said, as more than 800 international scholars, including some of the world's top experts in the Holocaust studies and genocide studies, have said, this is unfolding genocide, which means that the international community, every single state, has a duty to act to prevent genocide. And it's a televised genocide, banning water, food, medicine, basic life-saving needs from entering, reaching 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, trapped in a tiny area completely controlled by Israel, is exactly a treatment of a population set for extermination in a ghetto. This is what it is. So it's not a crime here and a crime there. It's put together, the indiscriminate bombing from the air, land, and sea, plus the complete total siege and banning water and food, leads to slow death or fast death of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. Yesterday, a church was attacked. A bomb fell right next to a church, killing a Christian Palestinian boy and injuring his family. Before that, hospitals were bombed, schools were bombed, a UN center was bombed where people were sheltering. There's no place to escape. So this is the reality on the ground. The main problem is part of the world, the Western major powers, are not just silent, they're completely partnering with Israel's far-right, fascist-leaning government in committing this genocide against Palestinians. And no one can, after seeing this, unsee it. Once you've seen it, once you learn that this is what's happening on the ground, UN experts and top international genocide studies experts are saying it's genocide, you cannot unsee it, you cannot unhear it.
Part of the issue of what's actually happening is that for anybody looking at it from outside, there's so much disinformation, it's not very clear what is actually unfolding. Take the hospital, for example. There were headlines, international media headlines saying Israeli airstrike kills 500 Palestinians inside a hospital. The next day, it turned out that perhaps the story was somewhat different. Is that part of what's happening? There's so much disinformation and misinformation circulating. It's really not clear to anybody what's happening.
Well, then you resort to experts in the field that are neutral, like United Nations experts, like human rights centers that are respected worldwide. This is where we get our most reliable information. Ignore disinformation from any side. Israel's army are compulsive liars. It's not like they have a record of being so honest. I mean, one lie after another for 75 years. And that's the only way a settler colonial regime can exist for 75 years. Lying and lying and lying until it sticks. And this is the key point. We're dealing with a system of oppression that has existed for 75 years. And that's the beginning of all violence. So even if we ignore a massacre in this hospital or a massacre in this school, and every massacre counts, every precious human life counts, but it's about a system of oppression, of colonial oppression. In India, you would understand that very much. When the Indians were fighting against the British for liberation, when Gandhi was leading Indian liberation movement, hardly anyone around the world knew what was happening in India. There was no social media, there was no media except controlled by Britain and its allies. No one knew, but people instinctively supported the Indian Revolution because they knew It's a colonial power subjugating, even starving in many cases, millions and millions and millions of Indians. So people stood with the Indians for national liberation. And this is the same situation here. We're dealing with a national liberation struggle by an indigenous population against a settler colonial state that is now committing genocide.
You know, I'm going to come to the broader issues because obviously the question around Israel and Palestine and what happened, it's a complex, complicated issue which dates back a really long time, as you well know. I'll come to the broader question, but specifically out here, it has to be said that the point that the Israelis would make is this entire situation was precipitated immediately by a terrible terrorist attack by Hamas on the 7th of October, the murder of a lot of civilians and innocents out there, and the taking of hostages. And that is something which also needs to be addressed and perhaps condemned, including by people like you.
Okay, but where do you start the timeline? You cannot just conveniently start the timeline with a reaction to an undergoing oppression, basically. So as a human rights defender, I have to take a morally consistent position. Our movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS movement, as an anti-racist human rights movement that advocates for nonviolent forms of resistance, that is inspired by Gandhi and Martin Luther King and many, many other struggles worldwide, we adhere to international law, which says people under foreign occupation and colonization have a right to resist by all means, as long as they respect the prohibition against targeting civilians. So as a movement, we've never condoned harming civilians. It's illegal. We never.
But that is exactly what happened on October the 7th, isn't it? So you're talking about Mahatma Gandhi, you're talking about other. Mahatma Gandhi would speak out very openly and directly. He called off the entire independence movement at a time of violence at Chauri Chaura. So would you be condemning the terror attacks?
But Mahatma Gandhi would bring the context, which is British imperialism, British colonialism, and this is what's important. The great Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire once said, with beginning the system of oppression, violence begins. So when you have a colonial system, that is the beginning of violence. Anything after that is a reaction to this initial violence. So as a human rights defender who wants to end all violence, and believe me, I do, I personally, and the movement that I am part of, want to see an end to all violence, whether from the oppressor side or the oppressed side. Because violence leads to more killing, to more suffering, to more misery. We want to end all violence. But the most effective way to do so is to address the root causes of violence, which is oppression. That's why we are working non-violently to end oppression.
All right. Omar Barghouti, thank you so much for joining us with that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.